Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Let's resume all of that discussion on Active Directory that we were doing before, holidays and other projects interrupted it briefly. And today, I'm planning on talking about FSMOs, or FSMOs, Flexible Single Master Operations. Now, in order to explain what these are and break it down, let's do that thing I always do and talk about the history of how we got to where we are now, just to put it in context. So, Windows NT, way back before Windows 2000, when you had NT 3.51 and then NT4 domains, not Active Directory yet, just domains, you had a structure where there was a primary domain controller. It did all the updates. Then you had backup domain controllers, which could essentially function as a backup read domain controller, but all the updates went through the primary domain controller. This is essentially single master operation. There's only one device that's in charge of doing all the updates in the entire domain. Fine. But then we actually got Active Directory on the scene. And Active Directory, starting in Windows 2000, built on top of the NT4 domain structure. And Active Directory brought in multi-master replication, where every domain controller can make changes to the domain. And so with multi-master replication, there is no single device that does all the updates, period. But there are still a few operations where, for consistency's sake, you really only want one device making updates. You don't want 5, 10, 20 domain controllers all making updates to these specific pieces of information. So, there are 5 FSMO roles. They are flexible, which means that they can move around, not automatically, just when an admin tells them to move, but they can be on any domain controller. And if the domain controller receives an FSMO role, then it becomes the single master for this particular operational role. And that's where we get flexible single master operations roles. Now, what are the 5 FSMOs, or FSMOs is just what I call them because FSMO. I have a habit of pronouncing my acronyms, never mind. There's 2 FSMOs that are specific to the forest. There can only be one of these in the entire forest, which, as a reminder, a forest can have multiple domains under it. Think of a big multinational corporation that has sub-companies underneath it. Each company might be a single domain, but there is one forest that connects all of them. Okay. And then the other 3 FSMOs are within a domain. So there will be 3 of these in every domain, and the remaining 2 are just in the forest. Period. Okay. So let's start with the forest. The first one is the schema master. And if you've watched the video I did previously on what the schema is and why it's so important, then you probably already have a really good idea of why there's only one device that updates the schema. Because the schema is essentially the blueprint or the template for what every object type contains and what objects exist and how they're referenced, you do not want multiple devices trying to update this simultaneously. There needs to be one, and only one, in the entire forest, because only that one has the authority to make updates that affect the entirety of the forest structure through all of its domains. So that's the schema master role. The other one that is forest-wide is the domain naming master. The domain naming master pretty much does exactly what the name says. It keeps track of the various domains. And if you're adding a domain within a forest or removing a domain within a forest, it's this FSMO that's involved, because it has to verify that the domain is unique. It has to verify that the domain's not already taken. It needs to update all of the other domains to make them available, that this is there, it's now a thing, and it updates the forest's records accordingly. Okay, so these are pretty obvious why these are, things that are only one in the entire forest. And if you're going to change these roles, you have to do so through the specific tools for it. And it's not Active Directory users and computers. Because these are the two that are forest-wide, the schema master you can update through the schema management graphical snap-in. But as I've mentioned before, Microsoft does not actually register that by default, for very good reason. You don't want people messing around in it. But if you go through and register the DLL for schema management so that the system sees that it's there, then you can go in through that GUI tool and choose where the schema master should go. Or you could just use PowerShell and be done with it. In fact, you can use PowerShell to move all of these around, but in a single command too, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The domain naming master, you go through the snap-in Active Directory. It's not sites and services. I want to say Active Directory domains and trusts, I think is the name. I'm a little foggy on it because I don't have to use it very often. But if you go in there, you can change the operations master location for the domain naming master as well. Okay, good enough for the forest. How about within the domain? There's 3 in the domain. The first one, and one of the most commonly encountered, is the PDC Emulator. Remember that this started with NT 3.51 and NT for domains, where there was a primary domain controller, and that was the only one that did the updates. For legacy compatibility reasons, now that you've moved to a multi-master model, there's still no guarantee that all of your Windows clients or member servers understand that you can do everything through any domain controller. So there is one domain controller that acts as the PDC Emulator. It emulates that role. And there's a couple of other things that it does. The PDC Emulator is the master time clock for the entire domain. If you've watched my previous video on Kerberos, you know that Kerberos depends on the devices being basically within 5 minutes time difference of each other. If they're more than 5 minutes apart, then the Kerberos timestamps don't align and you can't authenticate to each other. So the primary domain controller keeps the master time that the rest of the domain, all of the other machines in the domain, use as their time reference. And they all make sure that they are in sync with the primary domain controller emulator. This also means that your PDC emulator is the only device in a Windows domain that you want to have synchronized to an external time source. And that's typically through NTP. Technically speaking, you can have any machine, clients, servers, whatever. You can have all of them reference an external time source. But in a domain, it is of utmost importance for authentication that they all stay in sync with the PDC emulator. And so by default, they'll do that. the PDC emulator is really the only one that you need to change to keep it up to date with an external time source. There's one other thing a PDC emulator does. It is the authoritative place where any security-related changes are made first. Not only, but first. So anytime somebody's password is changed, the domain controller that's making the change notifies the PDC emulator first. Because if there's ever a conflict where the user says their password is this, but I thought the user's password was that, the primary domain controller emulator is the authoritative source because it is the primary domain controller in the old domain structure. And so if there's ever any doubt, that's where all the questions are going to be sent first. Like, okay, maybe the password is changed and I just haven't been replicated to yet, so I'm just going to reach out and ask the PDC emulator first. So anytime such a change is made, that has to go to the PDC emulator first because that's the authority within the domain. Cool. The other two in the domain, they are the RID master, the RID master, and the infrastructure master. The RID master is the relative ID master. If you've looked at the object security identifiers in Active Directory, that long string of, numbers and an S every now and then, it's okay. There's a domain component to that, which is fixed for the domain and was allocated by the domain naming master in the forest. Cool. But then there's a number on the end, and that is the relative ID within the domain. But if every domain controller can make additions and changes as it wishes at any time, what guarantee do you have that a domain controller in New York and a domain controller in Berlin don't happen to create an object with the same relative ID, and because they're so far apart, they aren't replicated to each other at the time they make this update? You would end up with two different objects with the same security ID, and that's a bad thing. That's a very, very bad thing. So each domain controller actually has a pool of relative IDs that is allocated to it and it alone. So if you update a domain controller in New York, it knows I have a pool of relative IDs sitting here that are mine to do with as I wish. I can make updates and changes using this pool, and the domain controller in Berlin can make updates and changes using its pool of relative IDs. And that way you're guaranteed that you never have objects created that will collide with each other. The RID master is the one source that allocates these pools of RIDs to each domain controller in the domain. We're getting complex here, I realize, but that is an important thing to remember in Active Directory. If you're talking about a single small business environment or even a medium-sized business environment with multiple domain controllers, you're probably not thinking about multinational scope, and yet it's the same structure. So these roles, while they're not terribly important for most small to medium biz-sized, administrators, they're much more important when you're talking about large enterprise scenarios. And so that influences the design of the Active Directory domain structure. So, last one, the infrastructure master. And I've left this till last for an important reason. If you think about a forest where you've got many, 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 many domains and lots of objects in each domain, how does a computer know what objects are available? Any user can go through, right-click on a folder, and start setting up security permissions for something that they own, right? If they want to add a principal for another object in another domain, or in, if you have two forests that are in a cross-forest trust, which is something you can set up, how do you know what's available? Where does the lookup happen? One of the options that we saw when I was creating a demo Active Directory domain was a checkbox that said Global Catalog. A global catalog domain controller includes a partial replica of all objects in a forest. So that if you're looking for what objects are available in every domain under the forest, a global catalog server will have them. But if you broaden your horizon to an entire enterprise, if you have a single server that is keeping a partial replica of every single object in the forest, you might have 50 domains. You might have 100 domains with 100,000 objects in each domain. Your global catalog server needs to be provisioned with enough resources that it can house this database and be able to look through it relatively quickly. And so you might not have the resources to have every domain controller also be a global catalog. If that's the case, the infrastructure master is responsible for updating references for cross-domain objects. And this is where it gets complex. So think with me here. If I have looked up and set a reference, say in a file share, to an object, a group in another domain, okay, part of that reference is its distinguished name, which includes the organizational unit it's in, the domain it's under, and the name of the group. What happens if the group name is changed? What happens if they've reorganized their domain structure and they've created a new organizational unit, maybe one specifically for groups, maybe it's a sub one specifically for file permission groups, and it got moved? If the object has moved, then it changes the distinguished name. And so if you have just a regular domain controller that is trying to interpret these references, you need something to go in there and make the official updates. The infrastructure master does that. However, remember that we also have these global catalog servers that have a partial replica of all objects in the forest. And it turns out the infrastructure master is programmed to only make these updates for objects that it does not store locally. Which means if you put the infrastructure master role on a global catalog, it doesn't make any updates anymore, because the global catalog has a partial replica of all objects in the forest. And therefore it'll say, I don't need to update any of these objects. They're all local to me, so I don't have to do anything. That may not be what you want in your domain. There are a couple of situations where this is okay, however. If you are a small domain, or even a medium domain, if every single domain controller is also a global catalog, then all of your domain controllers contain all the objects, or a partial replica of all the objects in the forest, and therefore the infrastructure master is not needed. And it can go anywhere on any of those DCs because they're all global catalogs as well. If you have a situation where only a few DCs are also global catalogs, then yeah, you need to put your infrastructure master on one that is not a global catalog. But for small to medium domains, maybe every DC is also a global catalog. Okay, cool. Then it doesn't matter where you put the infrastructure master because everything's always up to date anyway. There's one other unique situation. Remember from a previous video again that there is an optional feature for the Active Directory recycle bin. And as it turns out, when the Active Directory recycle bin is enabled, every domain controller becomes responsible for updating the references for any object that it updates, modifies, deletes. It doesn't actually hand that off to the infrastructure master anymore. When the recycle bin is enabled, every domain controller becomes responsible for doing this work itself. And when that's the case, there's actually no work left for the infrastructure master to do at all. It'll still exist. It's not like you can tell it, dump this FSMO role. You can't get rid of that role, but that role will not actually have any work to do anymore. So it becomes functionally superfluous, and it can go wherever you want because the Active Directory recycle bin is domain-wide. So, okay. So if all of your DCs are global catalogs, you don't need to worry about where the infrastructure master goes. If you've enabled the Active Directory recycle bin, there's nothing that the infrastructure master has to do anyway. Whatever. But all the other roles, still very important. So how do we move these around? And are there circumstances that change how we do this? I'm not going to actually get into demonstrating it live today, but it's really easy to use your search engine of choice to look up how to move FSMOs through PowerShell. And that is what I would recommend, because you can move all of those with a single command, or whichever ones you want. You can pick and choose. If you're going to move the operations masters on the domain level, remembering there's only 3 of them, you can do that through Active Directory users and computers. You right-click on your domain, you go to the operations masters selection, and whichever domain controller you are currently connected to, you can tell that domain controller to take that FSMO role. And what it will do is it will reach out to the current FSMO holder and organize the transfer and say, we're officially transferring responsibility for this FSMO role from you to me. And you can take that role. But what happens if you've had a domain controller crash? I know it happens. And you can't actually contact that server anymore. There is a way to take the role. The official word in this case is seize. You seize that role by force. But if that happens, you have to make sure that the machine that you seized it from never comes back online again. Because if it does, it thinks that it's still the holder of the FSMO role. And now you've got 2 machines that are trying to update the same thing for a critical part of the domain or forest that needs to only have 1 machine doing the updates. And so bringing that back online in that case, you cannot allow. You just can't. It will break things. So if it's gone offline and you're 100% confident it is never coming back, there are procedures you can follow. It's not through Active Directory users and computers, but you're going to have to use other tools to seize the FSMO role. I'm sure you can do it in PowerShell. I've never had to do it in PowerShell. I've had to do it through NetSH, the older ways of doing it, but you can seize that role. Try not to. try wherever possible to transfer or take the FSMO role gracefully, because, that works better. But if, for some reason the worst happens, you can seize that role to another DC that is still operational. So there's a glance into the world of the FSMOs. And yeah, it's somewhat more complicated or complex. Certainly for small to medium businesses, this is complexity that you're rarely, if ever, really going to have to deal with. But if you're working with much larger domains that have many different sites and may have other domains within the forest that, span a large area with many different buildings, this is where the FSMOs come into play, and this is why they come into play. So hopefully you found that interesting, illuminating, maybe even useful, I could hope. If you have thoughts on other things that you'd like to hear me talk about or things that you'd like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.